seconds to do that. All right. And yeah, nothing else to do but just click the radio button or the circle that's right next to your answer, and that will record it for us. Thank you all very much for participating in this quick poll. All right. So with that being said, it is 12, and we will go ahead and begin with today's webinar and our presentation. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's grant solicitation, the OJJDP FY 2020, Reducing the Use of Isolation in Juvenile Facilities Grant Solicitation. My name is William Moore, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center, and I want to welcome you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I do want to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. One of those important announcements is that we have experienced high usage of our webinars during our presentation, and so please note that if any time that you experience an audio issue or if it sounds like myself or the presenter cuts out, please be patient. We will dial back in. We do have contingency plans and precautions to reconnect, but we do appreciate you all for being a little patient during this time of high usage of our webinars. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on Intact's YouTube page. Also, for those wishing to download a copy of important documents and resources related to today's webinar, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here, you'll find an FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions. Just simply click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, please note that our presenter will indeed provide a Q&A session where you all will be able to submit your questions in the chat box for our presenter. Just simply type your question into the chat box as they arise, and they will be addressed at the end of today's grant solicitation webinar. Now, for those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. If you're viewing by yourself, there's no need to do anything at this time. However, if you're viewing in a group, please go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. Again, if you're viewing alone or by yourself, there's no need to type anything at this time. However, if you're viewing in a group with multiple people, meaning more than one, please take a minute to type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. Again, if you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. All right, and with that being said, I will now turn today's presentation over to our presenter and moderator, Julia Allenan, for today's webinar. Thank you all very much for joining us. And Julia, take it away.
Thank you so much, William. Good afternoon to those in my time zone, and good morning to those calling in today from around the country. I am an OJJDP Grants Management Specialist, and any awards made under this solicitation that you've expressed an interest in will become a part of my funding portfolio, and I'd be assigned as your OJJDP Program Specialist. Let me start by thanking all of you for your interest in this funding opportunity and for taking the time to participate in today's webinar. We have provided you a brief roadmap here of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to provide you a general overview about this funding opportunity. Then I'll talk a bit about the goals, objectives, activities, and deliverables that OJJDP had in mind when we developed this opportunity. I'll go over the basic application requirements for you, and then I'll share a number of general tips for developing a successful federal funding application. And after that, as William mentioned, we'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions that remain unanswered. And if I'm unable to answer your question on the spot, I'll take note of it and we'll get back to you after today's webinar. We provided for you here a direct link to the solicitation for your convenience. I'll give you a moment to click on that link in the slide in case you wish to have the solicitation open in another window of your browser as we move through the presentation. Please take note that any applications for funding under this solicitation must be submitted no later than 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on April 27th. So OJJDP anticipates awarding as many as 5 grants under this solicitation for a total of $3 million. Applicants may request up to $600,000 in their proposal, but not more. And I want to emphasize that any request above $600,000 would disqualify your application. There is no match requirement for this opportunity, but if for any reason you elect to include a voluntary match, please be aware that a voluntary match becomes subject to audit alongside your federal award. Each project that gets funded under this solicitation will have a project period of 36 months, and work will begin on or after October 1, 2020. The overarching goal of this solicitation, as the title suggests, is to support your efforts to safely implement effective strategies to reduce the use of isolation in your juvenile facilities. And we know that the widespread use of isolation, including solitary confinement, as a behavior management tool or sanction in juvenile correctional and detention facilities can have harmful consequences for confined children and youth.
Please hold while I confirm your passcode. Thank you. Your passcode is confirmed. When you hear the tone, you will be the 5th person to join the meeting.
Agency, policy, practice, and culture in order to safely reduce the use of isolation in your juvenile facilities and to advance rehabilitative goals. One of your registration comments asked me to define isolation for purposes of this solicitation. In general, of course, isolation refers to physically and or socially isolating a youth for punishment or for administrative purposes, and that includes solitary confinement. However, there is no nationally agreed on definition of isolation, and we are inviting applicants to define isolation in accordance with your facilities for purposes of your federal funding application. You are encouraged to identify and employ best practices for reducing the use of isolation based on research that has been put into practice by jurisdictions that have already successfully reduced the use of isolation. A couple of your registration questions asked for us to point you to some guidance. The organization Performance-Based Standards, PBS, has developed standardized, uniform, and comparable data on the use of isolation, and they recently published I guess it was a 2019 publication, Reducing Isolation, a report on the key findings of national isolation data. And that report highlights these key findings on isolation and room confinement, including historic trends and changes in data. The Council for Juvenile Correctional Administrators, CJCA, has developed a helpful toolkit on reducing the use of isolation, summarizing the research, substantiating those negative impacts of isolation, highlighting studies, case studies from successful state agencies, and setting forth some concrete action steps for directors and strategies for reducing the isolation or the use of isolation in youth correctional and detention facilities and helping youth become successful members of their communities. So the projects that we will fund under this solicitation will adopt a mission statement and philosophy that reflect rehabilitative goals, will develop policies and procedures for the use and monitoring of isolation, You'll identify data to manage, monitor, and be accountable for use of isolation, if any. You'll develop alternative behavior management options and responses. You will train and develop staff in the updated approach. You'll develop and implement policies and practices for reducing the use of isolation, and you'll implement programs that promote effective alternatives to the use of isolation. Those of you who have read past OJJDP solicitations over the years may have noticed that this year's solicitations offer relatively minimal specificity or guidance. This minimalism reflects an intentional effort by our agency leadership to be non-prescriptive and to create space for you, the experts on the unique needs and conditions in your respective jurisdictions, to posit local solutions and responses tailored to your youth, your families, and your communities. So let's talk about who's eligible to apply under this solicitation. We are accepting applications from states, from territories, from units of local government, and from federally recognized tribal governments. I want to flag for everyone who has already downloaded the solicitation from Grants.gov that on page 2 there was a statement regarding eligibility that limited applications to those who provide services to youth under age 18. I want to clarify we have updated the solicitation just today, so you will see a correction to the effect that states, territories, localities, and tribes proposing to develop programs, policies, and practices to reduce the use of isolation in juvenile facilities, regardless of the age of the offenders held, are absolutely eligible to apply under this solicitation. So you may wish to download an updated copy of the solicitation after the webinar. Under the solicitation, OJP is giving priority consideration to applications from federally recognized tribes and also to applicants that will enhance criminal justice and public safety by indicating their agreement to comply with one or more specified law enforcement related conditions. Priority consideration simply means that applicants will receive additional points in the application scoring process. I want to be very clear that receipt of report priority consideration for either of these two categories does not guarantee that an application will be funded, nor will a failure to receive priority consideration or to ask for one mean that an application won't be funded. It's just a way to gain additional points if you happen to fit into one of those two categories. For those of you who may be new to the world of federal fund seeking, I want to flag a critical and time-sensitive administrative step. Before you can submit an application for funding, you will need to register your organization online at Grants.gov, and I'll invite you to act now and not wait, because the registration process may take up to 10 to 14 business days. And if you ultimately elect not to pursue this particular opportunity, at least you'll be poised to pursue the next one. There are 4 distinct steps in registering as an organization applicant in Grants.gov. I won't go into each of them today because you have been provided the Grants.gov customer service hotline and email address on page 2 of the solicitation to help you through that process if it is new to you. After you complete the registration process at Grants.gov, you will need to obtain a username and password for OJP's Grants Management System, which you'll hear us refer to as GMS. If you've never used GMS before, you'll create a GMS profile for your organization. And if your organization is already set up in GMS from a previous application or award, please log in anyway and make sure you have access and ensure that your profile is up to date. And you'll also need to verify your System for Award Management, or SAM, registration in the Grants Management System. SAM is the system we use to assess risk associated with a funding application. We also have a GMS help desk that can assist you with these processes, and I strongly recommend you tackle this process earlier rather than later in case you run into any technical difficulties requiring assistance. So before I came to OJJDP, I was a federal grant seeker and a federal grant recipient in the nonprofit sector. In fact, I was a grantee for 3 times longer than I've been a federal grant manager. Over the years, my work was supported by numerous federal awards, including awards from OJJDP and other DOJ components. So I know firsthand how daunting the federal grant application writing process can feel, particularly to first-time applicants or after you've had a disappointing outcome. And so I hope that I can offer you some insight into the application writing process today. To that end, I'll share a few tips on the process of planning and writing your application, and I hope these will help you submit a successful funding application. For those on the line who are seasoned federal grant writers, please bear with me while I share some tips for folks who may be new to the process. As you begin to plan and organize your writing, it really does pay to develop an application task list and timeline for yourself as soon as you decide to apply for funding, and then prioritize those tasks that may require more lead time. Some of the components of a successful funding application can take time to pull together. For example, you'll want to identify and contact any project partners and supporters early. Give yourself time to enter into MOUs, obtain sub-budgets, collect letters of support, that kind of thing. If you do plan to partner with another agency or with a subject matter expert on whatever project you're proposing to undertake using federal funds, you really can't write an effective proposal without working closely with that partner or expert to develop the application. You may need them to help you with their portion of the project design. They may be useful in supplying data and language to strengthen your statement of the problem that you aim to address through your project. It would be difficult to develop a feasible budget without a realistic understanding of how much to designate for subawards or contracts. You'll need them to supply resumes and other information to support the section of your application that illustrates your collective capacity to execute the project. And your application may be strengthened by the inclusion of detailed letters of support or memoranda of understanding from relevant key stakeholders or from proposed partners or subrecipients. As you begin to review the selection criteria and develop your proposal outline, take care not to skip questions or omit components of the program narrative as they are described in the solicitation. It's important to respond to the questions and organize your proposal in the same order the questions and components appear in our solicitation. I've had the opportunity to observe many peer review panel consensus calls over the years as either a peer reviewer or as the assigned OJJDP subject matter expert, and I've seen reviewers give an application a lower score because one component, when unanswered, one component was missing, or the reviewer missed the required component because it wasn't located in the correct section of the application. They just didn't see it. So you're better off thinking of the solicitation guidance as a template, an outline for your program narrative, not merely as a suggested or preferred format. We have provided in your solicitation document a couple of checklists to help you successfully navigate the various steps of the application process and to help you ensure that your application is complete before you submit it. Particularly for those of you who are new to the world of federal fund seeking, please be sure to carefully review Appendix A, the portion titled What an Applicant Should Do, and that's on page 15 of the solicitation. All applicants should use Appendix A, What an Application Should Include, to ensure that your application meets all of the requirements before you submit it. And that checklist is on page 16 of the application, or rather of the solicitation. At the bottom of page 8 and continuing on the top of page 9 of your solicitation, we spell out applicable page limits, line spacing, font size and type, and margin parameters. Page limits are strictly enforced. Peer reviewers are directed not to consider any content that appears after the maximum allowable page limit is exceeded. So while there's rarely, if ever, a minimum number of pages, it is generally wise to use most or all of the maximum allowable number of pages. Your competition will. Font size and spacing requirements also important to observe. For example, single spacing your narrative when the solicitation calls for double spacing may result in your application being deemed to exceed allowable page limits, causing your application to get eliminated or portion of it not to be considered during our basic minimum review process. So pay close attention when you're reading the solicitation to which elements can be single-spaced and attached in a narrative and which must be double-spaced. The various application elements required of this solicitation are set forth on pages 8 through 10 under Section D, Application and Submission Information. Please pay special attention to the program narrative and the budget detail worksheet. The budget detail worksheet must also include a budget narrative. These components of your application are deemed critical, and that means that your application will not move to peer review if these elements are missing from your application. I'll share a few pointers in a moment about what we'll be looking for you to include with respect to each element of your application, but first I want to point out that our solicitation spells out the relative weighting or value of each element or component of your application. We actually tell you exactly how much the peer review panel will weight each section. So when you're deciding how many pages to invest in the various sections of your project narrative, for example, a section worth 10% should not consume 50% of your page limit or your drafting time. Also take care, again, to address the entire question that you see in the solicitation associated with each element of the application. So here are the key elements of your application. First, your description of the issue. This is worth 10% of your overall application when the peer reviewers review it. This is sometimes referred to as your statement of the problem. It's a required component of the program narrative for just about every federal solicitation I've read to date. Your program narrative statement of the problem should identify the service area that your project will address, describe the nature and the scope of the problem you're proposing to address through your program, and use data to provide evidence that the problem exists, to demonstrate the size and severity of the problem, and to document the effects of the problem on your target population and on the larger community. Be sure to cite the source of any data or research that you reference in the narrative. Be sure to describe any research or evaluation studies, whether they're published or unpublished, that relate to the problem and contribute to your understanding of the identified problem's causes and potential solutions. I can't tell you how many times I've seen reviewers ding an application for failing to support the statement of the problem with data. So take advantage of existing data sources that might support your statement of the problem. For example, for juvenile specific data, check out OJJDP OJJDP And if there simply is no data available to support your statement of the problem, for example, if a lack of data collection is part of the problem you're proposing to address through the project, then state that clearly. Explain why you're unable to supply much supporting data. Be sure to describe the target population that will benefit from your program and describe any previous or current attempts to address the problem that you've identified and aim to address. Next section is your project design and implementation component of your application. It's worth 45%, so you'll want to spend some time on this piece. Spell out your proposed project-specific goals and objectives, activities and deliverables. Detail how your project will operate throughout the funding period and describe the strategies that you'll use to achieve the goals and objectives you've identified. Describe how you'll complete the deliverables stated on page 5 in the goals and objectives section of our solicitation. Identify any existing strategic plans in your state or state plans in your jurisdiction that are relevant to your project, and describe how your project aligns with those existing plans. Be sure to identify each partner agency, if any, that has demonstrated commitment to this effort via a memorandum of understanding or letter of support. The strongest letters of support and MOUs spell out very clearly how partners will support the project, what resources they'll dedicate, and how much time they'll commit to your project. Identify any training and technical assistance needs associated with your proposed project and build any required experts, if any, directly into your project design and into your budget. This is one of the questions that one of you submitted when you registered for the webinar. There will not be a separate solicitation funding a dedicated national training and technical assistance provider for this particular program of work. So you will need to build that expertise right into your program and your budget. Include details regarding any leveraged resources, whether they be cash or in kind, from local sources to support your project, and be sure to discuss plans for sustainability of the project beyond the grant period. That's another thing that peer reviewers look carefully at, is whether you have made the case that this project, that we are standing you up to have a sustainable project that outlives the grant. Submit a realistic timeline or milestone chart as a separate attachment that indicates major tasks associated with your goals and objectives for the project and assigns clear responsibility for each, and then plots completion of each task by month or quarter for the duration of the award. Next section of your application is your capabilities and competencies section. This is worth 25% of your overall application to the peer reviewers. Describe in this section the experience and capability of your organization and that of any contractors or subgrantees that you'll use to implement and manage this effort and to manage your award. Highlighting any previous experience implementing projects of similar design or similar magnitude, and prior experience managing federal awards generally. You'll want to highlight your collective experience and capacity to manage subawards if you're proposing to include any in your project, including details on your system for fiscal accountability. You'll want to detail your management and staffing patterns clearly and show how they're clearly connected to the project design that you've laid out in the previous section. You'll describe the roles and responsibilities of project staff that you've identified and explain your program's organizational structure and operations. And to support that, you'll include a copy of an organizational chart showing how your organization operates, who manages the finances, how your organization manages subawards, if you've proposed to make any, and the planned management of the project that you're proposing we fund. Let's talk about budget. Your budget detail and narrative are collectively worth 10% of your overall application. We're recommending that you draft your budget early in the application writing process and familiarize yourself with unallowable costs such as food and trinkets, and caps on expenses. For example, there's a $650 a day rate cap for consultants. OJP provides a link to our budget template. That's on page 16 of the solicitation, page 16. That template includes a combined budget detail worksheet and narrative, budget narrative. It's in the form of an Excel workbook. Within that workbook, there is a sample worksheet that has been included as a resource in the tab labeled Example Budget Detail Worksheet. And here's why it might be a good idea for you to use our budget template. When peer reviewers are plowing through 15 lengthy applications, it can be very helpful when they become familiar with a particular budget format. It makes it easier for them to locate all the required budget elements that they've been instructed to look for in every application. Our budget template categories, the budget categories match OJP's budget categories, whereas the budget categories in your agency's accounting system might not perfectly match ours. Our template has built-in narrative boxes and breakdowns to ensure that you clearly explain the numbers for each budget category and break them down effectively. And our template includes separate budget worksheets within the workbook for each project year. as well as an additional worksheet that contains the overall budget summary. And the formulas are already built right into the Excel workbook, so it's plug and go, very hard to screw up. So recommending that you consider using our budget workbook. Some things that peer reviewers look for when they review a budget include reasonableness of your proposed costs, how your budget is or is not being cost effective, and how you're leveraging resources. So those are some things to keep in mind. I've seen reviewers ding an application because they were convinced the applicant's budget could not adequately support the activities and deliverables that applicant described in their project narrative. The work was more ambitious than the budget. So if you've identified a separate funding source to cover some of the proposed activities and deliverables, be sure to spell that out. There is a non-federal column in OJP's budget template where you can spell out any funding you're bringing to the table, even where a match is not required, as here. We are not requiring a match for this project. And a reminder, if your funding request exceeds the maximum funding amount spelled out in the solicitation, that's $600,000, your application will be eliminated during our basic minimum review process. Exceeding the maximum, even by a few dollars, is a painful and totally avoidable way to get eliminated from consideration. So it bears repeating twice. A few additional budget tips for you. There should be no expenses in your budget that are not also referenced in your program narrative. Your personnel costs should relate to the key personnel for your project. Because OJJDP is not funding a dedicated TTA provider for this project, again, you should identify any training and technical assistance needs associated with your project and build those costs for those directly into your budget. Your budget narrative should leave no unanswered questions about the purpose of the requested funds and should provide a detailed computation for each budget line item, listing the total cost of each and showing how it was calculated. That's something people often leave out. Be sure that your budget summary, the last tab or worksheet in your budget detail workbook, matches the amounts entered into your Form SF424, which is another form you'll be completing for your application, with regard to the total amount you're requesting and any voluntary match that you elect to include. You should demonstrate in your budget narrative how you will maximize cost effectiveness of award expenditures, in particular to justify the proposed costs in relation to potential alternatives to achieving those same project goals. Your budget narrative should explain how you estimated and calculated the costs that you've included and how those costs are necessary to the completion of the proposed project. And as with the budget detail worksheets, your budget narrative should break down those costs by year. One final tip, don't get fancy with your budget and try to PDF the Excel workbook. Simply populate the Excel workbook and upload it as is. That's my advice to you. In one case, I saw an application eliminated during the DMR process, the basic minimum review, because the applicant's budget included only 1 year, because the applicant attempted to PDF the workbook and only the first worksheet of the workbook was captured in the PDF, thereby omitting the worksheets for years 2 and 3 as well as the summary. So she never reviewed the PDF before uploading it, and it was a really terrific application that never got considered. Performance measures. Your plan for collecting the data required for this solicitation's performance measures is worth 10% of your overall application. You are not required to submit performance data with your application. However, successful applicants will be required to submit performance data as part of your semi-annual reporting requirements should you get an award. So for purposes of your funding application, you'll need to demonstrate your clear understanding of the performance data reporting requirements for this grant program and detail how you will gather that required data should you receive funding. We've provided you on page 10 of the solicitation a direct link to OJJDP's required performance metrics for this specific project. So be sure to take a good look at those click on that link before you describe your plan for collecting this required data. Before you submit your application, pay close attention to those application checklists I referenced earlier. You don't want to be summarily disqualified after all your hard work on an avoidable omission. It's well worth taking the extra time to review the checklist and review each document individually before uploading and submitting. And remember, don't forget all of the required attachments when you're scrambling to get an application in on time while juggling your normal work and duties, and these days possibly juggling kids home from schools that are closed during this public health crisis. It's especially easy to forget to upload one attachment. That one document, if it's a required one, is enough to get your application eliminated from consideration. And it also could be the document that pushes your application score above another applicant by strengthening it somehow. You won't be able to add additional attachments after the submission deadline passes, so make sure you check your list thrice before you submit. It's also okay to reference in the project narrative that a particular relevant separate attachment exists to ensure that your peer review panelists know to look for it. Pay special attention to how you name each file you upload. The last thing you want is for a peer reviewer to overlook a file because the document name didn't clearly identify the content. As a reminder, this solicitation closes and all applications are due by 11:59 p.m. Eastern on April 27. I recommend you aim to submit at least a couple of days before that deadline. Do not wait until the very last minute. We've seen that lead to heartache. Some of you are aware that some guidance went out to the field this week about deadline extensions for solicitations. Those extensions pertained only to solicitations closing in March. As of right now, the application deadline for this solicitation is still April 27. OJP will continue to monitor the situation and determine if additional adjustments to closing dates will be needed and communicate with the field. But as of now, it's April 27. There is a formal review or appeals process if an applicant misses the submission deadline or for applicants who are notified that their application was eliminated during the basic minimum review, but it's a very high bar. On a few occasions when I've seen an appeal granted, the underlying error or system failure was very clearly on our end, not applicant error or applicant omission. And typically, all applicants will receive notification by September 30 for successful applications and sometimes a little later in the fall for unsuccessful applications. Again, we've provided you here a direct link to the solicitation in case you missed it at the beginning of this presentation, as well as a link to the associated FAQs, which simply pull out key information from the solicitation, making it a little easier to get at that critical data. I'll give you a moment there to click if you wish. We've also supplied a few additional helpful tools and resources for you. You can find information on how to apply or respond to OJP solicitations in the OJP Grant Application Resource Guide. We also offer a basic Grants 101 online tutorial as well. And before you write your application, you may wish to take a look at prior year solicitations and awards to study past awards and look at OJP award data to enhance your understanding of what successful applicants propose to do with OJP funds. Finally, NIJ's crimesolutions.gov website is one potential source for supportive data for your application statement of the problem. And I mentioned earlier, JJGPS is another data source I mentioned that's worth looking at for juvenile-specific data. Let's talk briefly about the peer review process. Before your funding application even reaches the peer review phase, it has to clear that preliminary screening phase to ensure your application meets the basic minimum requirements. Again, those mandatory required elements of your application are spelled out right in the solicitation. They include the project narrative, the budget detail worksheet, and the budget narrative. Applications are typically reviewed by 3 peer reviewers who score your application against the review criteria, which you'll recall are set forth in the solicitation and tell you the relative weight reviewers will assign to each component of your application. And finally, if at first you don't succeed, be sure you ask us to send you the peer reviewer comments on your application before you try again. The peer reviewer comments will be aggregated and anonymized, so you may occasionally find conflicting comments here and there where 2 reviewers disagreed on some point in your application, but you should come away with an overall solid sense of what was well received and where you could make improvements the next time you apply for DOJ funding. So if you've had an unsuccessful application in the past or a successful one, now is a good time to reach out to us and ask for those comments before you submit your next application. Okay, before I open the floor to Q&A, I just want to let you all know that OJJDP relies on all of you to be our eyes and ears on the ground. We want to hear from you about the pressing needs of justice-involved youth in your communities. We want to hear about obstacles and challenges you're facing in the field, and also about promising programs and practices where you work and live. We want to hear your best funding ideas, because when we develop concepts, when we write solicitations, and when we make funding decisions, we are using what we learn from all of you every day to ensure that we're funding the right efforts and activities. And with that, William, I'd like to open it up to questions. Okay.
All right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yes, the questions are available for you there. Julie, if you'd like to take a look at them and address them.
Yes, thank you. So I see a question: can applicants, such as a juvenile detention facility, apply alongside a youth-serving nonprofit, such as a Boys and Girls Club, that provides additional behavioral interventions for youth as an alternative to isolation? Absolutely. There are some specifications in the solicitation that spell out who can be the primary applicant, but you can absolutely partner with other organizations. You can pass through funding. You can absolutely partner that way and have subrecipients or even procurement contracts for some of the work that you develop as your program. Another question: because no match is required, should it be specifically omitted from the application? No. A match is not required, but some folks elect to include a voluntary match. So that is entirely up to the applicant, whether you need or wish to do that based on the scope or complexity of your project, and based on whether the amount that we have offered, $600,000 per award, is sufficient to do whatever it is that you want to do. I'm confused about the use of both Grants.gov and GMS. Why can't we submit the applications in GMS like we do with the Title II formula grant? I can't answer the why. I can only say that both steps are required, and they're required in the specific order that we lay out in the checklist and also in this webinar. So be sure that if this is a new mechanism for you, because you've previously been able to apply through the simple GMS process, that you reach out to our help desk and let them walk you through that process. Any other questions from folks on the phone? I'll give you a moment to think. And if you do have questions after this webinar, we'll certainly be happy to address them. All right, seeing no other questions, before I pass this back to William, I just want to thank everyone who took the time to join us today for the webinar. for the phenomenal work that we know you already do every day to constantly improve how youth, families, victims, and communities experience the juvenile justice system in your jurisdiction. It's really our privilege to support some of your fine work through this and other funding opportunities. William?
Yes. And thank you all
passing
again.
it back to you.
Okay, yes. I want to make sure my audio is coming in okay, which I do believe it should be, which is perfect. All right. So just to let the audience members know, if you did not get a chance to submit your question, please note that we do have the response center that's located on this slide here. Feel free to submit all of your questions or any of your questions, the information that's located on the slide here. But again, I want to give a very special thank you to Julia for taking her time out today to go over today's webinar and today's solicitation information for our audience. Before we adjourn today, I would like to invite all of the audience members to please be sure to check us out at OJJDP's INTAC by following us on Facebook. You can also join us on our listserv as well if you'd like to get more information about upcoming events. You can reach out to OJJDP by visiting the OJJDP Help Desk. You can dial the number that's on the slide here, or you can even provide an email or submit an email if you have any questions as well. Do you have a training or technical assistance need? Well, if so, you can submit it through OJJDP's TTA 360 platform that is located or accessible through the URL located on this slide. Again, just as a reminder to everyone that this, along with other webinars, are posted on INTAC's YouTube page. The YouTube page URL link is located on this slide. If you'd like the transcript or even supporting materials, you can contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk for any supporting materials. And please, for those who've joined us, don't forget to join us for another few events that we have coming up, posted on this slide. One set for March 20th, another one set for March 26th. These Learn More links are indeed live, so you can click on the link to learn more about each of these webinars. You can also register for each of these webinars through the links here. And also note we have a few other events coming up in April and in May that we'd like you all to join. You can simply, again, click on the Learn More button here to learn more about the webinars and the Register Now button so you can register for each of these webinars. And finally, before we adjourn, I do have one last poll question for our audience members. How do you plan to